He grabbed her arm in front of everyone, in front of her fiancé, in front of people she'd known since she was 16 years old, and squeezed just hard enough to make a point. "You don't belong here," Preston said quietly, his voice so calm it was almost kind. "You never did." Imani Caldwell didn't cry. She didn't scream. She pulled her arm back, looked him dead in the eyes, and handed him the ring he had spent 18 months convincing her she deserved to wear. Then she walked into that ballroom alone. And that was the moment everything changed, not because she found strength she didn't know she had, but because a stranger across the room saw exactly what Preston Hale had just thrown away, and decided he wasn't going to let that moment pass quietly. If this story made you stop scrolling, you're exactly who needs to hear it all the way to the end. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because the stories we tell on this channel don't let you go easy. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to love you, hit that like button. This one's for you. The parking lot of the Harrington Grand Hotel smelled like cut grass and expensive cologne, and Imani Caldwell stood beside a white rental car in her burgundy dress, the one she'd found 3 weeks ago and loved immediately, then almost returned twice because Preston kept asking if she was sure about the color. She was sure about the color. She was less sure about everything else standing in front of her right now. Preston had his hands in his pockets. That was the first sign something was wrong. Preston Hale never put his hands in his pockets when he was about to deliver good news. He put his hands in his pockets when he was about to be dishonest about something and wanted to look casual while doing it. Imani had known him for 12 years. She recognized the posture before she recognized the expression. "I need to tell you something before we go in," he said. She waited. Preston looked at the ground, looked at the hotel entrance, looked at her car, looked everywhere except at her face. "Vanessa's going to be here tonight." Imani kept her voice even. "Vanessa Crow." "Yeah. Your ex-girlfriend. From high school." "We've been talking." He said it quickly, like speed would make it smaller. "For about 4 months. I should have told you." The air between them got very still. Imani had spent 10 years in crisis communications. She had sat across from executives who lied under oath and politicians who rewrote their own histories in real time. She knew exactly what it sounded like when someone built up to a confession by testing how much honesty they could release without losing control of the situation. 4 months, she said. "It started as just catching up. Old friends, you know." "Preston." He stopped. "Tell me what you're actually trying to say." He finally looked at her. And Imani knew before the words came, because she had always been better at reading people than she gave herself credit for, and because some part of her, a quiet, careful part she had been ignoring for months, had been waiting for exactly this. "I think I still have feelings for her." The statement landed without ceremony. No dramatic pause. No music swelling underneath it. Just a man in a suit telling his fiancée in a hotel parking lot on the night of their 10-year high school reunion that 4 months of secret conversations had unraveled 2 years of engagement. Imani's hands were still. She noticed that about herself. She had expected them to shake. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know this is terrible timing. Is there good timing for this?" He flinched. "No, I didn't want to walk in there with you and have it be a lie." She almost laughed. She almost told him that walking in there with her had been a lie for 4 months already, and that the ring on her finger had apparently become a prop in a story he was rewriting without telling her. But she didn't say any of that, because Imani Caldwell had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing about righteous anger was how easily it let other people feel like victims. She slid the ring off her finger. The motion was unhurried, deliberate. She held it out between them on her open palm, and Preston stared at it like it had become an unfamiliar object. "Take it," she said. "Imani?" "I said take it, Preston." He did. She straightened her dress, picked up her clutch from the hood of the car, and started walking toward the hotel entrance. "Where are you going?" he called after her. "Inside," she said without turning around. "I already paid for this ticket." The ballroom of the Harrington Grand was exactly the kind of space a 10-year reunion was designed for, chandeliers positioned to make everyone look slightly more glamorous than they felt. Round tables draped in white linen, a photo wall at the entrance covered in yearbook pictures that showed how much everyone had tried to look like they weren't trying. Imani took a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and stood near the photo wall long enough to confirm that yes, her yearbook photo still showed the girl she remembered. 16, round-faced, smiling a smile that was working very hard at being confident and not quite getting there. She looked at that girl for a moment. She looked away. The room was filling up. She recognized faces the way you recognize songs. The basic melody was the same, but time had remixed everything. Deborah Ashe had lost the nervous laugh she'd had in AP English. Marcus Powell carried his shoulders differently now, like the world had added weight to them. Charisse Jones, who had been painfully shy in homeroom, was holding court at the center table with the energy of someone who had spent the last decade being interesting at parties. Nobody approached Imani immediately. That wasn't new. She had learned in high school that being the biggest girl in the room often meant people were comfortable looking at you and uncomfortable standing next to you. The contradiction had exhausted her at 17. At 31, she had stopped waiting for it to change. She was navigating toward the bar, not for alcohol, just for something to do with her hands, when she heard the voice she had been hoping she could avoid for at least another hour. "Imani! Oh my God, you look—" She turned. Vanessa Crowe stood 3 feet away in a red dress that had clearly been selected to announce her arrival rather than cover it. She was thin, classically pretty in the way that photographed well and photographed often, with the polished, careful look of a woman who understood her appearance as a professional asset. Her smile showed every tooth. "You came alone?" Vanessa said, and the question was arranged to sound like concern while delivering something else entirely. "I came," Imani said simply. There was a beat. Vanessa looked past her, scanning the room, already searching for Preston, already repositioning herself in the space, already doing the quiet social math that told her where she stood relative to everyone around her. "Preston mentioned you two were coming together," Vanessa said. Her voice had the warmth of a draft. "Plans change." Another beat. Vanessa's smile adjusted slightly. The specific adjustment that certain people make when they receive information they already knew and are choosing to perform surprise. "Well," Vanessa said, "it's really great that you came. These things can be intimidating." Imani looked at her steadily. "Can they?" It wasn't a question. Vanessa seemed to register that because the smile shifted again, tighter now, less certain about which version of this interaction she was having. "I just mean, it takes confidence, you know, to show up to something like this and just," she gestured vaguely, "be yourself." The implication was as subtle as a billboard. Imani said, "Thank you, Vanessa," with a tone that communicated she had understood every word of the original message and was declining to accept delivery. Then she turned and walked to the bar. She had been standing there for approximately 4 minutes when Preston arrived with Vanessa on his arm, not beside him. On his arm. Like she was already wearing the space Imani had occupied an hour ago. Preston saw Imani the moment he crossed the threshold, and his expression went through 3 things in rapid succession: relief that she hadn't left, guilt about the relief, and then a performance of ease designed to cover both. The room noticed. These things moved through social spaces the way temperature moved through water, invisibly, thoroughly, and you only felt it once it had already reached you. A few people glanced between Preston and Imani with the particular calculation of people deciding whether to acknowledge what they'd just observed or pretend they hadn't. Imani watched a woman she vaguely remembered from chemistry class lean toward the person beside her and say something. The other person nodded and looked at Imani. Not unkindly, but not kindly either. Just assessingly. She heard from somewhere behind her a fragment she wasn't supposed to hear. "Already trading up, I guess." It was meant to be quiet. It wasn't quiet enough. Imani set her water glass down on the bar with care, because the part of her that wanted to throw it across the room was a part she'd been managing since middle school, and she had gotten good at it by now. She breathed once. She straightened her spine. She looked around the room, and she saw him. I was standing near the far end of the bar, slightly removed from the nearest cluster of people in the way that sometimes meant shyness and sometimes meant something else entirely. He was tall, not unusually so, but the kind of tall that combined with stillness and a well-cut suit into something that the human eye categorized as significant before the brain had caught up. Dark hair. A jaw that suggested a person who had weathered things without complaint. Tattoos at the edge of his collar and across the backs of his hands, which put him immediately at odds with the room's ambient aesthetic of gym memberships and vacation photos. He was not looking at her. He was looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who had agreed to attend this event for reasons that no longer seemed worth the inconvenience. Imani did not know who he was. She knew only that Preston was watching her from across the room, that Vanessa was laughing at something Preston had said with the loud transparency of a woman who wanted witnesses, and that the anger she'd been managing in her chest since the parking lot had become very, very tired of being managed. She picked up her water glass. She walked toward the stranger. Her heels were loud on the ballroom floor. She noticed that too. The specific sound of her own footsteps in a room where the background noise wasn't quite loud enough to cover them. Some small, honest part of her registered that this was a terrible idea executed with excellent posture. She stopped beside him. He looked at her. His eyes were dark and evaluating, and they did not perform surprise at her approach. "I need a favor," she said. Quietly. Directly. "And I'm going to be honest about what it is, because I don't have time to build up to it slowly." He said nothing. He waited. "My ex-fiancé just walked in with his new girlfriend. They broke up with me 40 minutes ago in the parking lot. The whole room already knows. And I would like to, for approximately the next 20 minutes, appear to be having a very interesting conversation with someone who is not watching me fall apart." She paused. "I am not falling apart," she clarified. "I just want to look like the furthest thing from it." The man studied her face for a moment. Then he looked, briefly, barely, with a specificity that suggested he already knew exactly where to look, across the room toward Preston. Something shifted in his expression, not quite recognition, more like confirmation of something he had already been certain of. "He's not worth it," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with the slight roughness of someone who chose words carefully, not because they were literary, but because they didn't like repeating themselves. "I know that," Imani said. "That's not why I'm doing this." "Then why?" She considered for a moment. Being honest about this was either going to be disarming or catastrophic, and she had approximately 3 seconds to determine which. "Because I spent 2 years choosing him," she said, "and I want him to spend the next 20 minutes wondering if that was a mistake." The stranger looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Something quieter than a smile. Something that suggested he found honesty more interesting than he found it comfortable. 20 minutes, he said. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't agree yet." "You were about to." He looked at her again. Different this time, like something had been added to the equation. "Dante," he said. "Imani." He picked up his glass. "Then let's have a very interesting conversation." She didn't know. Couldn't know, standing there with her water and her wounded dignity and her very excellent posture, that Preston Hale had gone very, very still the moment he recognized who she was standing next to. Preston's face had changed, not the surface of it. The surface was doing its best to remain composed, which was notable because Preston's face usually couldn't commit to a single expression under pressure. But something underneath had changed, some particular register of social confidence that he had carried his entire adult life. And Vanessa noticed before he could redirect her attention, and leaned toward him to say something, and he shook his head once, sharply, in a way that told her to stop talking. Imani was saying something to Dante about her glass of water being the most disappointing drink she'd ever held at a formal event. Dante was listening with the full, quiet attention of someone who was genuinely tracking the conversation and not simply waiting for his turn to speak, which was rare enough that she noticed it. She didn't notice Preston crossing the room. She noticed when he arrived. "Imani." His voice was tight in a way that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with effort. She turned. "Preston. Can I—" He glanced at Dante and made the instant recalibration of a man who had just realized the variable in his plan was more complicated than anticipated. "Can I talk to you for a second?" "I'm in the middle of a conversation." "Imani." His voice dropped. "You have no idea who that man is." She looked at him with the patient, attentive expression she wore when executives told her things they believed were significant. "He introduced himself," she said. "His name is Dante." Preston's jaw moved. "That's Dante Moretti." She waited. "Imani." He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice further. "He runs the Moretti organization. Do you understand what I'm telling you? This is not a person you—" "Preston." Her voice was level and quiet and cut through his sentence like it had been designed to. You broke off our engagement 40 minutes ago in a parking lot. Whatever concern you're performing right now is 40 minutes too late. She turned back to Dante. Dante was watching Preston with an expression of almost clinical stillness. Not threatening, simply present, in the specific way that made the space between them feel suddenly much smaller than the physical distance accounted for. Preston stood there for another 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked back across the room, and Imani tracked him from the corner of her eye long enough to see his shoulders do something complicated before he reached Vanessa's side. She looked at Dante. Dante looked at her. Moretti Organization, she said. Yes. Is that something I should know about? He considered the question with what appeared to be genuine respect for its directness. It depends, he said, on what you're asking. Are you dangerous? To you? She waited. No, he said. Not to you. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who was still doing a significant amount of internal accounting but had decided provisionally to accept the answer. Then I think, she said, that 20 minutes might have been a conservative estimate. And Dante Moretti, who had not smiled genuinely in a ballroom in longer than he cared to calculate, found that the corner of his mouth did something again that wasn't quite a smile but was getting closer. Across the room, Preston Hale watched the two of them talk, and understood, with a cold and specific clarity, that the woman he had just discarded in a parking lot was standing next to the one person in this city he could not afford to have as an adversary. He had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The problem was, he had no idea yet just how far the consequences were going to reach. The 20 minutes became 40, and neither of them counted. That was the thing Imani noticed first. Not that the conversation was interesting, though it was, but that she had stopped tracking time the way she normally tracked it in social situations. Usually at events like this, she had a running internal clock, a quiet countdown toward the moment she could leave without it reading as retreat. The clock had gone silent somewhere between Dante asking her what she actually did for a living and her explaining, with more honesty than she typically offered strangers, that crisis communications was less about fixing problems and more about managing the distance between what was true and what people were willing to hear. Dante had looked at her when she said that. Not the polite look of someone absorbing information, the specific look of someone filing it away. That sounds like a skill that gets used on you as much as by you, he said. She'd opened her mouth to deflect, closed it, said, yes. That's exactly what it is. He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something. That was the other thing. He didn't feel silence. Most people she knew, herself included, on difficult days, used words as insulation against quiet. Dante let silence exist between sentences without treating it as a problem to solve, and it made her more careful about what she said, because she understood instinctively that he was actually going to hear it. She was midway through telling him about a particular client, a pharmaceutical executive whose public statement had made a manageable crisis into a permanent career ending, when she became aware of Preston again. Not because he approached, because she felt the specific quality of being watched by someone who was trying not to look like they were watching. And she had developed an accurate radar for that particular frequency over the course of a decade, with a man who was, she was realizing, a great deal more transparent than she had given him credit for being. Preston was at a table with Vanessa and 2 other couples. He was smiling at something someone had said, but the smile was adhesive. It was stuck to his face rather than generated by it. Vanessa had her hand on his forearm. She was laughing with the fullness of a woman who was performing enjoyment for an audience, and the audience was Imani, and both of them understood this without acknowledging it. Imani turned back to Dante. He's watching us, she said. I know. Is that, she considered the word, a problem? For you? Dante looked at her with the patient steadiness of a man who had never in his adult life experienced Preston Hale as a problem. No. He seemed very concerned about your reputation. People usually are. Should I be? Dante was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man choosing accuracy over reassurance, which she appreciated more than she expected to. That depends on what you're planning to do after tonight, he said. It was not a threat. It was a genuine question, delivered with the kind of frankness she'd been spending the last 2 hours starving for. I was planning to go home, she said, order food, feel terrible for an appropriate amount of time, go to work Monday. And after that, She looked at him. I don't know yet. He looked back. That's honest. I've been told it's a flaw. By Preston? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Dante set his glass down. He turned slightly toward the room, not away from her, but enough to look at it from the same angle she was seeing it from, side by side rather than face to face. And he said quietly, he told you that honesty was a flaw because honest people are harder to manage. The accuracy of that sentence hit her somewhere between her sternum and her throat. She said nothing for a moment. Then, you figured that out from 40 minutes of watching him across a ballroom. I figured that out from 4 seconds of watching him cross the room to warn you away from me, Dante said. The rest of it was you. Preston detached from Vanessa's grip at 9:47. Imani tracked it from peripheral vision, Vanessa's hand reaching for his arm again as he stood, and his arm moving just slightly out of reach with the practiced non-motion of a man who had learned to create distance without being seen to create it. He said something to the table. Someone laughed. He smiled the adhesive smile and then walked toward the bar with the casual body language of a man going to get a drink, and not the body language of a man who had a destination. He arrived at the bar approximately 8 feet from where Imani and Dante were standing. He ordered whiskey. He did not look at them. Imani watched him not look at them and understood that this was its own kind of looking. Dante had gone quiet again. Not tense, quiet. There was a difference that she had started to identify over the last hour. Tense people generated pressure outward. Dante's stillness went inward, compressing, and what radiated outward was something else. Not calm, exactly. More like the specific quality of space that exists directly before a decision is made. Preston drank a third of his whiskey in one pull. Imani looked at Dante. You know him, she said. It wasn't a question. We've crossed paths. That's diplomatic. It's accurate. Is there more accurate? He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Assessment. She'd learned to read it by now. He assessed everything before he answered, not from evasion, but from precision. He did business with someone I know. It didn't end well for Preston. Imani processed this. What kind of business? The kind where you overestimate your value and underestimate the other party. She looked at Preston's back, at the set of his shoulders, which she had learned over years meant he was listening to a conversation he appeared not to be part of. How long ago? 14 months. She did the math quietly. They had gotten engaged 16 months ago. She filed the information in the place where she kept things she didn't have enough data to interpret yet. Is that why you agreed? She asked. To help me tonight, because of whatever happened with Preston. Dante didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with the directness that she had stopped finding jarring around the 40-minute mark. Partially, he said. Not entirely. What's the other part? You were honest about what you wanted and why. I don't encounter that often. She almost smiled. You encounter a lot of dishonesty. Constantly. And it bothers you. Everything bothers me, he said, and the flatness of the delivery was so different from self-pity that she actually did smile, briefly, and he watched it happen with the careful attention he gave to everything, and then Preston turned around. Preston looked at Imani's face in the moment. The smile was fading, and something happened to his own expression that Imani had never seen on him before. Not jealousy, though that was part of it. Something older. The specific expression of a man who has just seen his own calculation fail in a way he didn't anticipate, and who is now recalculating in real time and not liking what the new numbers say. He walked toward them. Imani straightened, not defensively, just aligned herself in the way she aligned herself before difficult client meetings. Feet grounded, shoulders back, expression professional and entirely unrevealing. Preston stopped in front of them and looked at Dante and then at Imani. I'd like to talk to you, he said to Imani, privately. I'm busy. Imani? Preston. Her voice was even. You said what you needed to say in the parking lot. I heard you. We're done. His jaw tightened. He looked at Dante and did the complicated social math of a man who was angry and frightened in equal measure and couldn't show either one. Can I have a minute alone with her? He said to Dante. Not a request, not quite a demand either, something in between, which was the worst negotiating position, and Imani recognized it immediately. Dante looked at Imani, not at Preston, at her. The question was real. He was actually asking. She said, "No, you can say whatever you want to say right here." Preston's nostrils flared once. He leaned slightly toward her, dropping his voice below the ambient noise of the room. "Do you understand who you're standing next to right now? He's not a businessman, Imani. He runs, I heard you the first time. Then why are you, because you don't get to break off our engagement in a parking lot and then come back 40 minutes later to make decisions for me," she said. Not loudly. Each word separated from the others with precise surgical spacing. "You don't get to tell me who to talk to. You don't get to be concerned about my safety after you spent 4 months lying about yours." Preston went very still. Something cracked in his composure. Not dramatically. A hairline fracture, the kind that didn't show from a distance but was structural. "I wasn't lying." 4 months, Preston. It was complicated. "I have managed communications crises for companies facing federal investigation," she said. "I understand complicated. What you had was a choice, and you made it, and I am asking you to respect mine." She held his gaze. He looked in that moment very much like the 17-year-old boy she had known in high school, and very little like the man she had agreed to marry, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not grief exactly, but the specific, exhausting process of a long-standing illusion completing its collapse. Preston looked at Dante one more time. Dante looked back with the expression of a man watching something be resolved without his participation, which was accurate. Preston left. The night wound down the way reunions always did, not with any particular conclusion, but with the gradual, collective decision that enough nostalgia had been spent and everyone had sufficiently confirmed that their lives were either better or worse than they were willing to admit publicly, and the parking lot began filling with people saying goodbyes that were mostly relief arranged to sound like warmth. Dante walked Imani to her car, where she hadn't asked him to. He simply fell into step beside her when she moved toward the exit, and she didn't object, and neither of them mentioned that this wasn't part of the original arrangement. The parking lot was cooler than the ballroom. She could hear her own footsteps again. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight." "You managed it yourself," he said. "I used you as a prop." "And I was a willing prop." He stopped beside her car. "You didn't actually need me." She looked at him. "The 20 minutes helped." "The 20 minutes gave you somewhere to stand while you remembered that you didn't need the 20 minutes. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about whether to argue with that, and deciding it was accurate enough to not bother. She opened her purse for her keys, found them, stood there for a second longer than the situation required. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." "Why does everyone in that room know who you are and what you do, and you're still in there like it's a normal Tuesday night?" Dante looked at the hotel behind them, at the light coming from the ballroom windows. "Because it is a normal Tuesday night," he said. "People's fear of you becomes ordinary when you live with it long enough." She thought about that. "Is that depressing?" "Occasionally." She nodded. She unlocked her car. She turned to him and said, "I hope the next time someone is honest with you, it's under better circumstances." And she meant it, and he heard that she meant it, and something in his expression did the thing again. Not quite a smile, but a movement toward one. "Drive safe, Imani Caldwell." She got in her car and pulled out of the parking lot without looking back, and she told herself that was the end of it. She was wrong. Monday arrived with the indifference that Mondays reliably offered, and Imani's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that she had worked in for 6 years and mostly liked, and her assistant Carla met her at the elevator with coffee and the specific face that meant something had happened that wasn't in the calendar. "There's a man waiting for you," Carla said. "He's been here since 8:30. He doesn't have an appointment. He said you'd know who he is." Imani took the coffee. Description. Tall. Very... Carla searched for the word with the expression of someone navigating competing adjectives. Composed. He has tattoos on his hands. He's been sitting in the chair nearest the window for an hour and a half, and he hasn't looked at his phone once, which I find honestly unsettling. Imani set her coffee on Carla's desk. "It's fine," she said. "You know who he is." "I'll handle it." He was sitting exactly where Carla described. Black jacket, dark slacks. Hands resting on his knees, not folded. Resting, the way people rested when they were comfortable with stillness. He had, as reported, not touched his phone. He was looking at the window view of the city with the same quality of attention he brought to everything else. He heard her approach and turned before she was in his direct line of sight. "You could have called," she said. "I don't have your number." "You could have sent a message through someone." "I prefer in person." She stood in front of him and looked at him for a moment. He looked back without the performance of apology for showing up uninvited, and she found, to her own mild irritation, that she found his consistency more disarming than an apology would have been. "What do you want, Dante?" He stood. "I was taller in the daylight than she'd registered in the ballroom. "I want to take you to lunch," he said. "If you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because the conversation on Saturday was the most honest one I've had in a long time, and I'm not ready to be finished with it." She held his gaze. Carla was somewhere behind her, pretending very convincingly to be busy with the printer. "I have a 1 o'clock, Imani said. "I know. Carla told me. I'm asking for 12 to 1. She looked back at Carla, who was suddenly deeply engaged with the printer paper. "One condition," Imani said. He waited. "You don't tell me how to feel about what you do for a living. I'll form my own opinions on my own timeline." Something moved through his expression. Respect, she thought. The real kind, not the performed kind. "Done," he said. Lunch was a restaurant 3 blocks from her office that she knew, but didn't usually go to at midday because the prices were designed for expense accounts, and the lighting was designed for conversations people didn't want overheard. She made a note of both and said nothing about either. He ordered water. She ordered the salmon and water and noticed he watched her order without the micro-expression that certain people deployed when a woman ordered food they considered ambitious, and she noticed she'd noticed and made another private note. They talked through 45 minutes without once discussing Saturday night. They discussed her firm, not what she'd achieved, but how she'd built it, which was a different question and one that people rarely asked. He listened with the same unhurried attention from the ballroom and asked precise follow-up questions that told her he had actually processed what she'd said and not simply waited for a pause to insert the next thing. She asked him about legitimate business, because she'd done 40 minutes of reading Sunday afternoon and the Moretti name was attached to a real estate development company and 2 restaurants and a logistics firm that appeared on paper to be entirely standard. He answered without evasion and without oversimplification. The legitimate operations were real. They were also, he said, looking out the window for a moment, the ongoing project of a man trying to move towards something different than where he'd started. "Why are you telling me that?" she asked. He looked back at her. "Because you said you'd form your own opinions on your own timeline, and I'd rather you have accurate information than a flattering version." She nodded. "That's either very honest or very strategic." "It can be both." She thought about that. "Can it?" He looked at her steadily. "Most real things are." Her 1 o'clock was approaching. She reached for her bag. "I have a question," she said, "and I want the real answer, not the managed one." "Ask." "Preston said you crossed paths. Something about business, 14 months ago. What actually happened?" Dante was quiet for 3 seconds. Exactly 3. She counted without meaning to. "I was introduced to someone in my network," he said. He presented himself as an investor with connections to a city planning committee. He wanted access to information about zoning approvals before they went public. He offered money. The person he approached came to me. Imani was still. "What did you do?" she said. "I told my contact to decline, and I had Preston's professional background reviewed because a man who tries to buy insider information once will try again." She set her bag back down. "And what did the review find?" "That he was engaged to a woman who was significantly more accomplished than he was comfortable with," Dante said, "and that he had been in contact with Vanessa Crowe for 3 months at that point, and that Vanessa had separately made 2 attempts to request meetings with people in my organization within the previous year." The table between them felt very quiet. "She was trying to get to you," Imani said. "She believed connections in my network could accelerate certain social ambitions she had. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet." Imani looked at her water glass. "And Preston was trying to give her something useful, to prove himself. To her." "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. The specific weight of it. The picture that was assembling itself from pieces she hadn't known she was missing. "I wasn't just reconnecting with an old girlfriend," she said. It wasn't a question. "No. He was—" She paused, organized the sentence. "He thought getting close to Vanessa and giving her something she wanted would secure her. And what she wanted was access to you. That's my understanding. And so the ring, she stopped. I don't know his internal reasoning, Dante said carefully. I only know what was observable. She looked up at him. You knew all of this Saturday night. Yes. Before you agreed to help me. Yes. She breathed in slowly. And you didn't tell me. I met you 40 minutes before the conversation. It wasn't my information to give you without your permission to have it. She stared at him. The anger arrived not as heat, but as the cold, pressurized variety that came from sitting with something terrible that was also logical. He was right. He had been right. She hated that he had been right. You could have said something on Saturday night, she said. After, in the parking lot. I could have, he said. I didn't because you'd already had enough truth for one evening, and because I wanted you to make the decision about whether to see me again without it being based on information I gave you. I wanted it to be your choice, not a reaction. She was very still. That's either the most respectful thing anyone has ever said to me, she said, or an incredibly sophisticated manipulation. I know, he said. You'll figure out which. She went back to work. She sat through her 1 o'clock and her 2:30 and her 4 o'clock check-in with her team, and she was present for all of them in the way that she had trained herself to be present when her internal landscape was doing something seismic. She asked the right questions. She noted the right things. She said goodbye to Carla at 5:45. She drove home. She sat in her parked car for 6 minutes outside her building before going upstairs. She poured a glass of water she didn't drink and stood at her kitchen window looking at the city in the early dark and thought about Preston buying and selling influence, and Vanessa circling Dante's world like a satellite trying to find an orbit, and herself at the center of something she had not chosen and had not been warned about, and the man who had known about all of it and said nothing and waited. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text message. I should have told you sooner. That's on me. I'm not asking you to accept the explanation. I'm giving it to you because you deserve the whole picture, not the edited version. D. She read it twice. She set the phone face down on the counter. She thought about picking it up and responding. She thought about not responding. She thought about the fact that she was standing in her kitchen at 6 in the evening, thinking about a man she had known for 48 hours, a man whose name carried fear in it like a loaded weight, a man who had sat across from her at lunch and handed her the most honest account of a complicated situation that she had heard in longer than she could currently remember. She thought about Preston's face in the parking lot. She thought about the way Dante had looked at her when she handed back the ring. She thought about all the ways she had been reduced in the last 10 years, by assumptions about her size, her volume, her ambition, her appetite, her unwillingness to soften herself to make other people comfortable. And she thought about how none of that had changed on Saturday night, and how something else had. She picked up the phone. She turned it over. She typed, "You're right that it's on you. I haven't decided what to do with it yet." She sent it before she could reorganize the honesty out of it. His response came in under a minute. That's fair. And then, after a pause, I'd like the chance to earn a longer conversation. She set the phone down again. She drank the water. She thought about the thing Preston had said in the parking lot. You have no idea who that man is. And the thing Dante had said at lunch, most real things are both. And the thing she had told herself on the drive home from the ballroom, which was that it was over, it was done. It was the end of a very strange night and nothing more. She had been wrong about that. She knew it now with the clarity that arrived not as comfort but as weight. She was standing at the threshold of something that would not be manageable, not be controlled, not be organized into the clean professional distance she had used for years to protect the parts of herself she couldn't afford to lose. She picked the phone up one more time. She typed, Tuesday, same restaurant, noon. She sent it. And in the moment after, before his response came, she stood in her kitchen in the quiet of her own life and understood that she had just made a decision she could not take back, not because of who Dante Moretti was, not because of what his name meant in this city, but because of what it meant that she was choosing this with every piece of information on the table, eyes open, no illusions left to hide behind. The reply came, I'll be there. She exhaled. Outside her window, the city ran its ordinary night. Somewhere across it, Preston Hale was sitting with Vanessa in whatever version of the future he had traded her for, and he did not yet know what was coming toward him from the direction he had stopped watching. and Imani Caldwell stood in her kitchen with an empty water glass and a phone with 2 words on the screen, and felt, beneath the weight, beneath the uncertainty, beneath the very reasonable fear of what she was walking toward, something she had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, not happiness, just the specific bone-deep sensation of a decision made without apology. She set the phone on the counter, face up this time, and went to find something to eat. Tuesday came the way significant days often did, without announcement, folded inside an ordinary morning. Imani was at her desk by 8:15 with coffee she'd made herself because the office kitchen was empty that early, and she preferred it that way. She had 3 client files open, a call with a media consultant at 10, and a folder on her desktop she'd been adding to since Sunday afternoon. The folder was labeled with a client code she'd made up, which was the professional habit of a woman who knew her assistant occasionally pulled up her screen to check on shared documents. The folder contained everything she'd found on Dante Moretti, not the criminal biography. She could find pieces of that in court documents and old news archives, and one long investigative piece from a business journal 4 years ago that was careful with its language and aggressive with its implications. She'd read all of it. She wasn't looking for the biography. She was looking for the contradictions. Every person she'd ever managed a crisis for had contradictions. Places where the public record didn't match the private behavior, not because they were hiding something dramatic, but because human beings were not consistent, and the gaps between what they presented and what they actually were tended to be more revealing than either version on its own. She applied the same methodology to Dante. She was looking for the places where the feared criminal organization boss didn't match what she'd observed across a ballroom and a restaurant table and 2 text messages. There were several. The real estate development company had, in the last 3 years, completed 2 affordable housing projects in parts of the city where development typically meant displacement. She'd found a quote from a city councilwoman describing the Moretti Development Group as unexpectedly community-oriented, which was the kind of phrasing a politician used when they were surprised and didn't want to explain why. The logistics firm employed a disproportionate number of people with prior convictions, not as a stated mission, but as a pattern in the hiring record she'd found referenced in a workforce development report. She was not building a case for him. She was building a complete picture because she had decided on Tuesday, and she wanted the decision to be a real one. She closed the folder at 9:50 and pulled up the media consultant file. At 11:45, she grabbed her bag and her jacket and told Carla she'd be back by 2. I was already there. Same table as Monday, which she suspected was not accidental. He stood when she came in. Not the performative kind of standing, the automatic kind, the kind that came from somewhere older than social calculation. And she noted it and sat down and didn't mention it. You found the housing projects, he said. She looked at him. How do you know that? Because you're looking at me differently than you were yesterday. And the housing projects are the thing that usually changes how people look at me when they've been doing research. She set her bag on the chair beside her. Is that what you want people to find? It's what I did. Whether I want people to find it is a different question. She ordered water. He had already ordered water. The server, a young man who recognized Dante and carefully did not show that he recognized Dante, took her order and left promptly. Why the housing projects? She said. He looked at the table for a moment. It was one of the few times she'd seen him direct his attention downward, and she cataloged it as significant. My mother lived in a building like the ones we developed, he said, in a neighborhood that got bought and cleared when I was 12. She spent 4 years in places that were technically housing and practically not. Imani was quiet. That's not an excuse for anything, he said. It's just the answer to your question. I didn't ask for an excuse. He looked up. I know. That's why I answered. They talked through 40 minutes again. The conversation had a different texture than Monday, less exploratory, more direct, the way conversations got when both people had spent time thinking and arrived with more specific questions. She asked about the logistics company. He told her about a man named Raymond who had run it for 6 years and who had been hired at 34 after a second conviction made him unhireable anywhere standard, and who had built the operation from 11 employees to over 90, and who was one of 3 people in Dante's life whose judgment he trusted without reservation. What are the other 2? She asked. He looked at her. One of them is my attorney. And the third? He picked up his water glass, set it down without drinking. I'm looking at her, he said. The table went quiet. She understood what he meant. She understood that he meant it seriously and not as flattery. She understood that it was too fast. They had known each other for 4 days. And she understood simultaneously that speed and accuracy were not always in opposition, and that she had known within 6 months that Preston would eventually fail her and had spent 18 more months overriding the knowledge. She didn't say any of that. She said, "That's a significant thing to say to someone you met on Saturday." "I know." "It doesn't make me uncomfortable," she said. "I just want you to know I heard it accurately." "I know that too," he said. "It's why I said it." She was back at her desk by 1:58. She worked until 6:30. She went home. She made dinner and ate it standing at the counter because the table in her apartment still felt like the place where she and Preston had eaten dinner, and she hadn't reassigned it yet. She watched 40 minutes of a documentary about deep-sea geography that she found genuinely calming, and then she went to bed and slept better than she had any business sleeping. This happened 4 more times that week. Different restaurants, different hours, once a walk through a park near his building that lasted 2 hours and covered no particular distance because neither of them had a destination. She learned things about him with the gradual accumulation of detail that characterized real knowledge, as opposed to the simplified version people usually offered. That he read constantly, but mostly nonfiction. That he had a consistent and unperformed contempt for people who treated service workers poorly. That he laughed rarely, and when he did, it was usually at something he'd thought of himself and hadn't meant to say out loud. And that the composure she'd read as coldness in the ballroom was something more complicated up close. He was a man who had learned to trust nothing that came easily, who had built the stillness around himself not to be intimidating, or not only to be intimidating, but because stillness was the only reliable indicator he had that he was in control of himself. A man who managed a criminal organization by being more disciplined than the people around him, more patient, more willing to take a longer view than the immediate landscape suggested was necessary. She didn't pretend any of this was simple. She also didn't pretend she wasn't there. The first indication that something was wrong came on a Thursday, 12 days after the reunion, when Carla knocked on her office door at 4:15 with a face that was doing its careful best to be neutral. "There's a woman who's been calling since this morning," Carla said. "She won't leave a name. She says she has information relevant to a case you're working on. She's called 4 times. Imani looked up from her screen. "Did she specify which case?" "She said, and I'm quoting because it was odd," Carla consulted her notepad, "the one she thinks is going well." Imani was still. "Put her through if she calls again," she said. Carla nodded and left. The call came at 4:41. "This is Imani Caldwell." "I know who you are." The voice was female, measured, with the specific flatness of someone who had rehearsed the opening of this conversation enough times to drain the affect out of it. "We haven't met. You know someone I used to work for. I'm going to need more than that." "Dante Moretti." Imani kept her voice level. "What's your name?" "My name doesn't matter. What matters is that you understand something before this goes further than it already has." A pause. "He has people looking into you." The room didn't change. The quality of the light through her windows didn't change. But something in the specific gravity of the space shifted in the way that space is shifted when a piece of information changed the meaning of other information retroactively. When you say looking into, I mean a full background investigation, professional history, financial records, family, social network, who you talk to, who you've worked with, whether you have any exposure that could be used or that could become a liability. Another pause, smaller. It started 5 days ago. Imani did the math. 3 days after their first lunch. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because I was the person who conducted the first investigation his organization ran on a woman he was interested in, 6 years ago. And I watched what happened to her." The woman's voice remained flat, but something moved underneath it. "She didn't know. She found out after the fact. By then the relationship had developed to a point where the information was leverage, even if he never used it explicitly." Imani said nothing. "I'm not saying he's planning to use it," the woman said. "I'm saying his default response to anyone entering his personal life is to gather enough information to have options. He's not conscious of it as control. He thinks it's protection." "Who are you?" Imani said. "Someone who left that organization 14 months ago and would like the women who come after me to have information I didn't." A beat. "I'm not asking you to do anything with this. I'm giving it to you because you deserve the whole picture." The phrase landed like a physical thing. The whole picture. It was exactly what Dante had said to her over text. Word for word. She sat in her chair and looked at her desk and felt the cold, clean arrival of clarity that came not from sudden understanding, but from the pieces of something she'd been almost seeing finally rotating into alignment. She said, "Thank you," and ended the call. She sat at her desk for 11 minutes without moving. Then she picked up her phone and called Dante. He answered on the second ring. "Imani, I need you to tell me something," she said. "And I need you to tell me the truth, not the version that protects the situation." A pause, the kind that was a fraction of a second too long. "Ask, did you run a background investigation on me?" The pause this time was 2 seconds, full seconds. "Yes," he said. The word was flat and immediate. No preamble, no softening architecture around it. Just the admission, delivered with the same precision he applied to everything, and she hated that she could recognize his honesty and be furious at the thing he was being honest about simultaneously. When? 5 days ago. 3 days after our first lunch. Yes. She stood up from her desk. She didn't know why. Standing didn't help. There was nowhere to go. She was on the 14th floor. But sitting felt like a position she couldn't afford. "What were you looking for?" "Vulnerabilities," he said. "Exposure. Anything that could be used against you if someone decided to come at me through you." "And did you find anything?" "No, you're clean." A pause. "Imani, I'm not finished." Her voice was very controlled. The specific control that came from anger that was disciplined rather than suppressed. "You told me at lunch Monday that you wanted me to have accurate information, that you'd rather I have the whole picture than a flattering version." That's a direct quote. "Yes. And simultaneously you were having my life investigated without telling me." "It's not," he started, and then stopped himself. She heard him stop himself, heard the pause that preceded a man catching a bad argument before it left his mouth. "It's not what?" she said. "I was going to say it's not what it sounds like, but I'm not going to say that because it is what it sounds like, and saying otherwise would be dishonest." "Then what would you say?" A long pause. Longer than any previous one. She paced the length of her office. 8 steps. Turn. 8 steps. And waited. "I would say," he said slowly, "that I have spent 15 years operating in conditions where not having information about the people around me was how people got hurt. That it is a reflex I developed for functional reasons, and that I am aware that a reflex built for one context does not automatically transfer well to another one. You investigated me like I was a threat. I investigated you like you were someone I wanted to protect. Those are not the same thing." "I know." "Do you?" "Because the effect on me is identical. Someone examined my financial records, my professional history, my family, and I didn't consent to any of it, and the person who ordered it is someone I was trying to trust." The line was quiet. "You're right," he said. "The effect on you is identical, and I don't have a version of this that makes it acceptable." She stopped pacing. "Then what do you have?" she said. "An apology that I know isn't sufficient and that I'm giving you anyway because it's true." His voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but stripped of the professional precision, something underneath it that was less managed. And the acknowledgement that if you end this right now, based on what you know, you would not be wrong. She stood at her window. The city was doing its afternoon thing, entirely indifferent. "Who told you?" he said. His voice had shifted again. Different register. "Who called you?" "Does it matter?" "It matters because someone in my organization reached out to a civilian I'm personally connected to, and I need to know whether that was loyalty to me, loyalty to you, or something else." "Why would it be something else?" A pause. "Because not everyone in my organization is happy about the direction this is going," he said. "And there are ways to end things that don't require open confrontation." She absorbed this. "You're saying someone may have called me not to help me, but to damage this." "I'm saying it's possible. I'm also saying the information they gave you is accurate, and that changes nothing about my responsibility for it." She sat down on the window ledge. It was not technically a seat, but it was a surface, and her legs wanted somewhere to be. "The woman said she left your organization 14 months ago." Dante was quiet for a moment. "I know who she is." Was she telling the truth about the other woman? The one who didn't know? A pause that had something different in it. not evasion, something older and less comfortable. Yes, he said. Her name was Marina. She found out 6 months into the relationship. She left. Did you understand why? Not at the time, he said. I do now. Imani pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum. Not dramatically. It was a reflexive pressure, the body's habit when the chest got complicated. Then you've done this before, she said, and you know where it goes. I know where it went, he said. I'm trying to make different choices. Trying. She let the words sit alone for a moment. Dante, you investigated me, while simultaneously telling me you valued my honesty, while asking me to trust you, while presenting yourself as someone who gave people accurate information. She heard her own voice, clear, cold. The voice she used with clients who had lied to her, not with anger, but with precision. That's not trying to make different choices. That's making the same choice with better vocabulary. The silence on the line lasted long enough that she checked to confirm the call was still connected. It was. Yes, he said finally. That's accurate. She did not end the call with a decision. She ended it by saying she needed time to think, which was both true and a way of not saying the other things she was thinking, and he accepted it without pushing, which was either respect or strategy, and she was too compromised right now to distinguish between them reliably. She went home. She did not eat dinner. She poured water, stood at the window, moved to the couch, stood up again, a circuit that her apartment was too small for but that her body apparently required. The anger had done what anger eventually did. It had spent its immediate force and was now cooling into something more complicated, something that had grief in it, which she resented. She did not want grief. Grief was for things that were finished. She sat on her couch and made herself think clearly. The facts were, he had run an investigation on her. He had admitted it immediately when asked. He had provided an explanation that was honest about its own inadequacy. He had said she would not be wrong to leave. The facts were also, the information the investigation found could theoretically be used as leverage. He had said no vulnerability was found. She did not know, and could not currently know, whether that was a complete answer. The facts were also, she had gone into this with her eyes open and had found something she had not accounted for, which was the difference between knowing someone operated in a dangerous world and understanding what that actually meant in daily practice. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She picked it up again and called a number she used professionally when she needed to think out loud without professional consequences. Her friend Desiree picked up on the third ring with the voice of someone who was on a couch and intended to stay there. Tell me. I need to think through something. Tell me, she told her. Not everything. Not Dante's full context. Not the details that weren't hers to share, but the architecture of it. Man I'm seeing. Found out he investigated me without consent. Admitted it immediately. Gave an explanation that was honest about being insufficient. Said I wouldn't be wrong to leave. Desiree was quiet for 3 seconds. He said you wouldn't be wrong to leave. Those words specifically. Is he a lawyer? No, but he chooses words carefully. Because a man who says you wouldn't be wrong to leave is also saying, but you might not be right to leave either. Imani pressed her thumb against the corner of her eye. I know. What are you actually asking me, Imani? She thought about it, really thought, not the version of thinking that circled the question from outside. I'm asking whether the investigation is a reason to leave or a reason to understand something I need to understand before I go further. Did he do it to control you? He said he did it to protect me. Do you believe him? She sat with that question for longer than was comfortable. I believe he believes that, she said finally. I don't know if the distinction matters. It matters, Desiree said. It doesn't excuse it, but it matters. They talked for 30 minutes. When she got off the call, she had not reached a conclusion so much as had cleared enough space to see the actual problem, which was not the investigation itself, but what the investigation represented. A man who was trying, genuinely, to operate differently, and who had old damage that made the trying harder than the wanting. She understood that. She understood it specifically because she had her own version, the management, the control, the precision. She applied to her own image and her own narrative because the world had shown her early and often that a plus-size black woman who did not control her own story would have it controlled for her. She knew what it was to have a protective reflex that became its own kind of cage. She didn't make a decision that night. She slept badly and woke at 5:40 and made coffee and sat with it in the early dark. At 6:15, her phone rang. Dante. She answered. "There's something else," he said. His voice was different from last night, tighter. The professional composure was there, but it was working harder than usual. "What?" Vanessa Crowe met with two people yesterday. One is a journalist at a city paper who covers organized crime and financial crime. The other is a man named Gerald Fitch who does private opposition research. Imani was very still. She was with them for 2 hours at a restaurant downtown. My contact photographed the meeting. "You have someone watching Vanessa?" After Saturday, I had her background pulled. When the background showed the prior contact attempts with my organization, I had her monitored. A pause. "I should have told you this also. I'm telling you now." Imani set down her coffee cup. "What does she know?" My contact couldn't hear the conversation, but Fitch specializes in building public narratives that damage reputations ahead of legal or social actions. He works for clients who want to remove obstacles. And the journalist has been working on a piece about my organization for 8 months. He's been looking for an angle that humanizes the story, something personal. The picture assembled itself with the sick efficiency of something she'd been trained to see. "She's going to give him me," Imani said. "That's my read. She's going to tell him that I'm involved with you, that I—" She stopped, organized it. "She's going to say I pursued you, that I inserted myself into your life for access, for money, for something. Yes." And the journalist gets his human angle, the woman from the reunion. And Fitch's client gets whatever comes from a story that ties me to a criminal organization and frames it as manipulation. "Yes." She stood up. She was barefoot in her kitchen in the early morning, and the city was just beginning its light outside her window, and she was standing in the middle of a situation that had just changed its shape entirely. "Who is Fitch's client?" she said. "I don't know yet." "Best guess?" A pause. "Preston has been making quiet inquiries about rehabilitating his professional profile. He's been framing the last several months as a period of poor judgment driven by bad influences. If he's the client, then destroying my reputation is his rehabilitation," she said. "He eliminates the version of events where he made the choices. He builds a version where he was misled. And if you're publicly framed as someone who manipulated your way into my world, the question of what he did or didn't do becomes secondary." She put her hand flat on the counter. She breathed in. She breathed out. "I need to think," she said. "I know. Imani, I need you to not say anything reassuring right now," she said. "I need you to let me think." A pause. Then, "Okay." She ended the call. She stood in her kitchen with her hand on the counter, and the coffee going cold and the city brightening outside and the full weight of what was in motion settling onto her with the specific gravity of a professional who understood exactly what a story like this could do to a career she had built from nothing, in a field where credibility was the only currency that mattered. 12 days ago, she had been a woman handing back a ring in a parking lot. Now she was standing in a story she hadn't written, assembled from pieces she hadn't chosen, by people who had decided that her presence was an inconvenience to be managed. She had two options. She could step back, distance herself from Dante publicly and completely, issue no comment, let the silence imply the story had no substance, lose whatever this was before it cost her what she'd spent 10 years building. Or she could do what she was actually trained to do. She looked at the city outside her window. She thought about Vanessa's face in the ballroom, the specific cruelty of a woman like her, the assumption underneath every part of this, from Preston's parking lot confession to the investigation to this, that Imani Caldwell could be moved around the board because she wouldn't fight back, because she had too much to lose, because the world had always treated her size and her gender and her skin as reasons to expect less from her. She picked up her phone. She dialed a number. Carla answered on the second ring, which meant Carla was also awake before 7, which meant Imani had hired correctly. "I need you to pull everything we have on Gerald Fitch," Imani said, "and I need you to find me the contact information for every source the organized crime journalist at the city paper has quoted in his last 8 months of work." A pause. Then, without question, "How soon?" "Yesterday," Imani said. "On it." She ended the call. She stood in her kitchen in the early light and felt the specific, focused clarity that arrived when the situation stopped being something she was reacting to and became something she was going to take apart from the inside, piece by piece, until the people who built it understood what it meant to aim at someone who dismantled crises for a living. She was not afraid. She was something much more useful than afraid. She picked up her coffee cup, found it cold, and went to make a fresh one, because what was coming next was going to require her to be very, very awake. The coffee was hot this time. Imani drank half of it standing at the counter while Carla's preliminary file on Gerald Fitch loaded on her laptop. She had moved from the kitchen to her small home office, a desk, 2 filing cabinets, a whiteboard she used for client crisis mapping, and she had her shoes on, which was how she knew she was serious. She did not work barefoot. It was an irrational rule she'd invented sometime in her late 20s and had never examined closely enough to dismantle. The Fitch file was thin on the surface and dense underneath. Public records showed a consulting firm registered 6 years ago, a LinkedIn profile that described him as a strategic communications specialist, a list of corporate clients that were carefully generic. What Carla had also pulled, because Carla was excellent and understood that the useful information was rarely in the front-facing documents, was a pattern of contract work attached to 3 separate civil lawsuits where opposing parties had experienced sudden, damaging reputation events in the weeks before trial. No charges. No proof of connection. A pattern that was only visible if you were looking for it and knew what to look for. Imani looked for it. She found it in 11 minutes. She pulled up her whiteboard. She wrote 3 names in a column. Fitch, the journalist. His name was Callum Reeves. She'd confirmed the byline against Dante's description. And Preston. She drew lines. Fitch operated for clients who needed public narrative damage done quietly and quickly. Reeves needed a personal angle for a story he'd been building for 8 months. Preston needed to reframe the last year of his life in a version where he was not the architect of his own failures. The lines converged at a single point, her. She stood at the whiteboard and looked at the convergence and made herself think about it without anger, because anger was useful fuel but a terrible navigator. The question was not what they were planning. She understood what they were planning. The question was where the plan was vulnerable, because every plan built on false premises had a structural weak point, and the false premise in this one was the assumption that Imani's proximity to Dante made her story controllable. They were operating on the theory that she would be silent or defensive or both. That a woman in her position, career at stake, personal life suddenly public, connected to a man whose name generated fear, would retreat, issue denials, or issue nothing. Let the narrative fill the vacuum she left behind. They did not know her professionally. That was the mistake. She picked up her phone and called Dante back at 7:40. "I need everything you have on Reeves," she said. "Sources, methodology, previous subjects. And I need to know who gave him his first substantive tip about your organization 8 months ago." A pause. "Why?" "Because I need to understand what he thinks he knows versus what he actually knows. The gap between those 2 things is where I'm going to work." Silence. Then, "I'll have someone pull it together." "By noon." "By noon," he said. She heard something in his voice. Not surprise, the register was too controlled for surprise. Something more like the specific quality of a recalibration. She filed it and moved on. "I also need a meeting with you tonight, not a restaurant, somewhere private, where I can work with materials spread out and nobody can observe the conversation." "My office," he said. "Fine." "Imani." His voice shifted, the managed precision loosening at one edge. "What are you doing?" "What I do," she said. "You handle your side of this, let me handle mine." Carla arrived at the office at 8:45 and did not comment on the fact that Imani had clearly been working for 2 hours before her. She put fresh coffee on the conference table, pulled up the research files on her own laptop, and said, "Reeves published 7 pieces in 8 months. His primary source for organizational structure was someone who left the Moretti operation. His financial crime angle is an accountant named Webb, who consults for the DA's office. His human interest angle is the gap. He hasn't found it yet." Imani looked at her. "You read all 7 pieces since 6 this morning." "I woke up early," Carla said, in the tone of someone who was not going to discuss their sleep schedule. "His human interest gap," Imani said. "That's what Vanessa is offering him. A woman from the reunion, personal connection, emotional arc. Carla sat down. If Vanessa frames it as you inserting yourself deliberately, targeting Moretti at a public event, cultivating a relationship for access or financial benefit, Reeves gets the human story he's been missing, and Fitch's client gets the narrative that reframes Preston as a man who saw trouble coming and tried to warn you. Tried to warn me in the parking lot, Imani said. The conversation becomes about his concern for my well-being rather than his infidelity. It's not bad architecture, Carla said. It's good architecture, Imani said. The problem for them is that it's built on a foundation they can't verify, and I have the tools to demonstrate why. She turned to the whiteboard. She added a fourth name below the column, Vanessa. She made 2 contact attempts with Moretti's organization before the reunion, Imani said. What were the dates? Carla checked her notes. 7 months ago and 4 months ago. Reeves started his piece 8 months ago. Imani drew a line. Vanessa made her first approach 1 month after Reeves began his investigation. Carla looked at the board, looked at Imani. She wasn't just trying to access Moretti's world for social reasons, Carla said slowly. She was a source, Imani said, or trying to be. She approached the organization to get information Reeves could use, thinking that brokering the story would give her the access she wanted. They rejected her. She pivoted to Preston, who she believed had enough proximity to Moretti's professional world to be useful. The room was quiet. That's the story, Imani said. Not the one they're planning to publish. The one underneath it. The materials from Dante arrived at 11:58, delivered by a man named Leo, who handed Carla a sealed envelope without speaking and left before she could offer coffee. Inside was a folder with documented contact logs, dates of Vanessa's organizational approaches, the names of the 2 people she'd spoken to, and a single page of notes on Reeves that was sparse but specific. Imani read it at her desk with the door closed. Reeves had one previous subject who had publicly refuted his reporting, a city councilman whose aide had been the actual source of the information Reeves attributed to council communications. The councilman had provided documented proof. Reeves had issued a correction, a small one, buried. His editor had noted in an internal email, obtained how, Imani chose not to examine too closely, that Reeves needed stronger source verification before publication. That was the lever. She called her own media at 12:15, not to ask permission, to ask one specific question about the legal exposure for a journalist who published a story based on a source with documented history of misrepresenting access to information. The answer was what she needed it to be. She ate a sandwich at her desk and worked through the afternoon with the focused, unhurried intensity of someone who had stopped being reactive and was now building something. At 4:30, her phone rang. Number she didn't recognize. She answered. Ms. Caldwell. Male voice, professional surface with something compressed underneath it. My name is Callum Reeves. I'm a journalist with the I know who you are, she said. A pause. I'm calling because I'm working on a piece that may include references to your name. I wanted to give you the opportunity to comment before publication. She leaned back in her chair. When are you publishing? We're targeting Sunday's edition. 4 days. What specifically would you be referencing about me? She said. Your relationship with Dante Moretti, the nature and timeline of that relationship, and certain characterizations of your role in how that relationship was initiated. Characterizations from a named source. I'm not in a position to from Vanessa Crowe, she said. The pause was a fraction too long. I'm not confirming source identities, he said. You don't need to. She kept her voice completely even. Mr. Reeves, I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer it. How many times did your source attempt to directly contact the Moretti organization in the 7 months before the event you're writing about? Silence. Because I have documentation of 2 separate contact attempts, Imani said. I have the names of the individuals she spoke to and the dates of those conversations. I also have documentation of her subsequent meetings with Gerald Fitch and with you. And I have 8 months of your published work, including the correction your editor required after your piece on the Garner Council communications. The line was very quiet. I'm not calling to threaten you, she said. I'm calling to give you what you said you were calling to give me, the opportunity to have complete information before you make a decision you can't undo. Ms. Caldwell. His voice had changed. The professional surface had developed texture. Are you saying your source has a documented conflict of interest? I'm saying that the story she's offering you is designed to serve a specific outcome for specific people, and that the documentation available to me would allow a very different story to be told about the same events, one that includes your source's motivations and her history of attempting to insert herself into a situation she was repeatedly excluded from. A long pause. What are you proposing? He said. I'm not proposing anything tonight. I'm giving you 48 hours to review what you have with fresh eyes. If you still want to talk after that, I'm available. She ended the call. Dante's office was on the top floor of a building in the financial district that appeared on the exterior to be a standard commercial property, and on the interior to be the workspace of a man who valued function over display. The desk was large and clear. The bookshelves were organized with the specific system of someone who actually used them. There was a long table along one wall that Imani claimed immediately, spreading her materials across it. Dante watched her from the desk. He had learned, over the last 2 weeks, to watch her work the way you watch someone do something that looked simple from the outside and was clearly not. The efficiency of it. The way she moved between documents without losing the thread. The way she annotated with a red pen and talked through conclusions out loud as she reached them. He had spent a significant portion of his adult life reading people for utility, for loyalty, for threat. Watching Imani work was the first time he had watched someone and found himself cataloging not what they could do for him or to him, but simply the fact of what they were. He did not say this to her. She would have told him it was beside the point, which it was, and she was working. Reeves is reconsidering, she said, without looking up. I gave him the conflict of interest documentation. He's a real journalist who got handed a story by a source he didn't fully vet. When he looks at it clearly, he'll see the exposure. And if he doesn't, then I give the same documentation to his editor with a formal complaint that his source has a documented personal motive for misrepresenting events. His editor already has concerns about his source verification. She made a note. He'll see it clearly. Dante was quiet for a moment. What about Fitch? Fitch has hired infrastructure. He goes where the client directs. If Preston's the client and the Reeves story falls apart, Fitch has no vehicle for the narrative. She looked up. What I need from you is confirmation that Preston's professional contact with your network is documented. Dates, names, what was discussed. It's documented. Can I have it? A pause. Not resistance. The careful pause of a man assessing terms. Why? Because if Preston tries to rebuild his story as concerned ex-fiancé who tried to protect me, I want documentation that his primary motive for approaching your world was self-serving. The contrast matters. Dante looked at her steadily. Using that documentation publicly links my organization to his actions. I know. I'm not planning to use it publicly unless he forces the issue. She held his gaze. I need it to have it, the same way you ran an investigation so you'd have information whether or not you used it. Something moved across his face. She had aimed that precisely, and they both knew it. I'll have it sent over, he said. Tonight. Tonight. She went back to her materials. He looked at her for a moment longer. Imani. She looked up. Have you decided? He said. Not about the case. She heard the actual question under the surface of the word. She looked at him. At the man who had investigated her and admitted it, and sat across from her with the specific quality of someone who was genuinely uncertain of the outcome and not attempting to manage it, which was new, she suspected, for him, and cost him something. I've decided I'm not leaving over it, she said. I haven't decided what the condition is for staying. Tell me when you know. I will. She looked back at her documents. Right now I need to focus. He nodded once and went back to his own work. And they spent 2 hours in the same room without requiring anything from each other, and that was its own kind of information. The call from Carla came at 9:17 that night, while Imani was still at the long table. Preston called the office, Carla said. He left a message. He says he wants to meet. He says, a pause, the sound of Carla consulting something. He says he knows what you're doing and he wants to talk before it goes further. Imani was still. Dante looked up from his desk. Did he say anything else? Imani said. He said to call him back tonight. He said it was urgent. She ended the call. She looked at Dante. He knows. Reeves called him, Dante said. After your conversation, he's looking for corroboration and called the person most likely to have it. which means Reeves told Preston I contacted him. She stood up from the table. Preston knows the story is in danger. He'll try to stabilize it, Dante said. He'll try to get ahead of it. She picked up her phone, turned it over in her hand. He wants to negotiate. Are you going to call him? She thought about the parking lot, the ring, the 4 months, the specific way he had leaned toward her in the ballroom, ostensibly warning her about Dante while actually trying to regain control of a situation he'd created. Not tonight, she said. Tonight I finished the documentation. She sat back down. She worked until 11:30 when Dante appeared beside the table with a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for and set it next to her materials without comment. She looked at it, looked at him. Thank you, she said. He returned to his desk. She drank the coffee and worked. Preston called her personal cell at 7 the next morning. She let it ring. He called again at 7:12. She let that ring too. The third call came at 7:28, and she answered it because she had what she needed, and because letting him sit with unanswered calls one moment longer was not strategy. It was the satisfaction of making him wait, which she allowed herself briefly and then released. Preston. Where are you? His voice was compressed. Not angry yet. The stage before anger, where everything was still being held under pressure. Home. We need to talk. Then talk. Not on the phone. In person. A pause. Imani, whatever you think you're doing, I'm handling a situation, she said, the same way I handle situations professionally. You should have thought about that before you handed Fitch my name. Silence. I didn't, he started. Preston. Flat. Complete. Don't. The silence this time had a different quality, the quality of a man recalculating. I need you to stop, he said. Whatever you have, whatever you're planning to give Reeves, it will destroy me. You're concerned about your career. I'm concerned about my life. His voice had cracked at one edge. Imani, I made mistakes. I know that. I'm asking you to let me fix it without burning everything down. She sat at her kitchen table. The early light was coming through the window again. You didn't think about my career when you gave Fitch my name, she said. Vanessa was pushing for it. I didn't understand what Fitch was going to do with, you understood enough to pay him. Another silence. How much of this do you actually have? He said. Quieter now. The specific quiet of a man abandoning a position. Enough, she said. Preston, I'm going to ask you something, and I want the real answer. Was any part of getting back together with Vanessa actually about her, or was it entirely about what you thought she could give you? A long pause. She told me... He stopped. Started again. She told me she had connections, people who could help me move into a different level of the market. I'd been struggling, and I thought, you thought she could give you access. Yes, and I was the obstacle. No, you were... He exhaled. You were the variable I hadn't accounted for. When she found out about you, she said I had to end it, that I couldn't have both. Imani was very still. She told you to break off the engagement, she said. Yes. In the parking lot. She said if I didn't do it that night, he stopped. She gave you a deadline, Imani said. Vanessa Crowe told you to end a 2-year engagement in a hotel parking lot before a reunion, and you did it. I know. His voice was stripped down to something she hadn't heard from him before, raw and ashamed and too late. I know what I did. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to not use what you have. Imani looked at the window. She thought about 2 years. She thought about the ring that had been on her finger for 18 months. She thought about the specific cruelty not of betrayal. She had survived betrayal before, but of the revelation that she had been a variable, a complication in someone else's calculation. I'm not planning to use the documentation unless Reeves's story moves forward, she said. If Reeves drops it or revises it substantially, nothing goes public. Not for me. And if he doesn't, then I do my job, she said. A pause. What does that mean for me? It means the story that gets told is accurate, and you'll have to live with accurate. She ended the call. Reeves called at 2 in the afternoon. I've been reviewing the materials, he said, and the source documentation you referenced. A pause with work in it. the pause of a man navigating professional discomfort. I have some concerns about the piece as it was developing. I would have concerns too, Imani said. I'm not going to run it in Sunday's edition. She kept her voice even. I appreciate you telling me. I want to be direct with you. There may be a different piece here, a more accurate one. If you'd be willing to— Not right now, she said. Maybe later, on my terms and timeline. Understood. A pause. For what it's worth, Ms. Caldwell, you're good at this. I know, she said. She called Carla. Reeves is standing down, she said. For now. And Fitch. His vehicle is gone. Without Reeves, there's no publication. Fitch's work becomes a document in Preston's filing cabinet that never sees daylight. She sat down. Felt the specific deflation that came after sustained effort, not failure. Just the body acknowledging that it had been operating at a level it couldn't maintain indefinitely. We're not done. But this part is done. You okay? Carla said. Imani considered the question. Getting there, she said. Vanessa found her on Thursday. Not by phone. In person, in the lobby of Imani's building at 6:45 in the evening, standing near the elevator in a gray coat with the specific composure of a woman who had been waiting long enough to get her expression right and was now deploying it. Imani saw her from 12 feet away and felt something that was not surprise. She had been half expecting some version of this, and was also not fear. Vanessa said, "We need to talk." Imani said, "Do we?" "You killed the story." Not an accusation, something flatter, closer to acknowledgement. "I gave a journalist accurate information," Imani said. "What he did with it was his professional decision." Vanessa looked at her. Up close, away from the ballroom's forgiving light, she looked tired in a way she was working hard not to show. The polish was still there, but the effort underneath it was visible, and Imani noted it with the professional neutrality of someone reading a situation clearly. "I'm not your enemy," Vanessa said. "I don't think you're anything," Imani said. "That's different from being enemies." Something moved across Vanessa's face. Not quite hurt. More like the expression of a woman who had prepared for anger and found indifference more difficult to navigate. "You have to understand why I did what I did." "I understand exactly why," Imani said. "You wanted access to Dante's world. You tried directly. It didn't work. You tried through Preston. That didn't work. You tried through a journalist and a reputation consultant. That didn't work either." She looked at her. "What I don't understand is why you thought any version of this was going to get you what you actually wanted." Vanessa said nothing. "Because what you wanted wasn't access," Imani said. "Access was just the shape of it. What you wanted was to stop feeling like you were standing outside something you deserved to be inside." She paused. "I understand that feeling. I felt it. But I didn't take it out on the person who happened to be standing where I wanted to stand." Vanessa's jaw was tight. "That's easy to say when you ended up where you are." "I ended up where I am by handing back a ring in a parking lot and walking into a ballroom alone," Imani said. "Don't make it into something cleaner than it was." She pressed the elevator button. "I'm not going to use what I have against you," she said. "That's not what I do. But I need you to understand something, Vanessa. Clearly, not as a social pleasantry." She looked at her directly. "This is finished. Whatever you're planning next, whatever variation of this you think you can build, it's finished. Because I know what you have, and I know what I have, and the math is not in your favor." The elevator opened. Imani stepped in. She looked at Vanessa one more time as the doors began to close. At the composure that was holding by effort, at the scheme that had run its course against someone who happened to be built for exactly this kind of terrain, and said nothing else. The doors closed. She rode up to her floor and walked to her apartment and sat on her couch and let herself be tired for the first time in 4 days. Fully, physically tired, the kind that lived in the back of the neck and the places between the shoulder blades and behind the eyes. Her phone buzzed. "Dante. How did it go?" She sat for a moment looking at the message. Then she typed, "Come over. I need to tell you the condition." The reply took 30 seconds. "On my way." She set the phone on the coffee table. She looked at her apartment, the desk where she'd built the whiteboard analysis, the kitchen where she'd stood in early morning dark and made decisions, the window she kept returning to when she needed to think. She thought about what she was going to say to him. She had practiced it twice in her head during the elevator ride, and both versions had been too careful, too organized, too much of the communication professional, and not enough the woman who had been standing in a parking lot 12 days ago with a ring coming off her finger, who had walked into a ballroom alone and found something she hadn't been looking for, who had spent 10 days building a defense against people who assumed she could be moved without consequence, and who had won that defense entirely on her own terms without a single act of fear. She was going to say it plainly. No management, no architecture, just the truth, in the same room as the person it was about, with no audience and no strategy. She was 31 years old, and she had just dismantled a coordinated reputation attack in 72 hours. And the man who was on his way to her apartment had investigated her without permission and admitted it immediately and told her she wouldn't be wrong to leave, and she had chosen not to leave, and now she was going to tell him what staying required. She straightened her spine. She waited. The knock came 18 minutes later, faster than the distance should have allowed, which told her he had already been moving before the message arrived, which told her something she added to the file she'd been building on who Dante Moretti actually was versus who the world had decided he was. She crossed the apartment. She opened the door. He looked at her with the full, unhurried attention she had learned to receive without deflecting, and she looked back at him with everything she had decided clearly visible in her expression. The condition, the boundary, the non-negotiable shape of what came next. And she said, "You don't get to protect me by having people investigate me. You don't get to make decisions about my safety without my knowledge or consent. And if you ever again gather information about my life without telling me first, I will walk out and I will not come back." She held his gaze. Those are not negotiating points. They are the terms. Dante looked at her. He did not look away. He did not offer the managed, precise language he used when he was in control of a situation. He said, "I understand." "Do you actually understand, or are you agreeing because it's the correct thing to say?" A pause. The real kind. The kind that meant he was locating something honest rather than strategic. "Both," he said. "And I know that's not sufficient, but it's where I am, and I'm telling you the truth about where I am instead of the version that sounds better." She looked at him for a moment. "Come in," she said. He did. And in the apartment that had been the staging ground for 72 hours of the most precise professional work she'd ever done on her own behalf, with the city running its indifferent night outside the window, Imani Caldwell and Dante Moretti sat across from each other and began the harder conversation, the one that had nothing to do with reputation or documentation or what other people had built against them, the one that was only about the two of them, in a room with no audience, with every card on the table and nowhere left to hide. Outside, somewhere in the city, Preston Hale was sitting with the consequences of accurate, and Vanessa Crowe was standing at the end of a scheme that had run out of road, and Gerald Fitch had a document in a filing cabinet that would stay there, and Callum Reeves was in a newsroom reconsidering the shape of a story he thought he understood. And none of them, not one, had seen this coming, not from the woman they had all, in their different ways, assumed was a variable. She had never been a variable. She had always been the equation. The conversation lasted 4 hours. Not the kind of 4 hours that felt long, the kind that felt like the correct amount of time for what needed to be said. And at the end of it, Imani was still on the couch, and Dante was in the chair across from her that nobody ever sat in because she used it for stacking things, and the city outside had gone fully dark sometime around the second hour without either of them noticing. She had told him what staying required. He had heard it. Not performed hearing. She had enough professional experience with men who performed listening while internally reorganizing what they'd heard into a version they could accept. And this was not that. He had sat with the specific discomfort of a man receiving information that confirmed something unflattering about himself. And he had not tried to reframe it, and he had not apologized more than once because she had told him once was sufficient, and anything more was about making himself feel better rather than actually addressing her. She told him about her mother, which surprised her. She hadn't planned that. But the conversation had moved into the territory of why they were both the way they were, and she found herself describing a woman who had been beautiful and capable and systematically dismissed by every institution she'd encountered, who had raised Imani on the twin principles of excellence and self-sufficiency because she understood that nobody was going to hand her daughter anything, and who had died of a stroke at 58 still working a job that was 40% below her actual competence level, because the people above her had never been able to see past what she looked like to what she was. Dante listened to this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, She would have had things to say about you right now. She would have been furious at Preston, Imani said, and me. Especially you. She looked at him. And then she would have watched you very carefully for 6 months and made a judgment based on what she observed rather than what she assumed. That's where you get it from, he said. The watching. The insistence on accuracy over narrative. She thought about her mother, about a woman who had refused until her last breath to let anyone else write the story of who she was, even when the story they were writing would have been easier to accept. Yes, she said, that's where I get it from. He told her about his father, which she understood was equally unplanned because his jaw did something particular when he began the subject, a small tightening that preceded a disclosure he hadn't fully decided to make. His father had run the organization before him, had built it through methods that Dante described with the blunt, effectless precision of a man who had long ago processed his feelings about his origins and arrived at something that was neither pride nor shame, but a kind of unflinching acknowledgement. He had inherited the structure at 26, after his father's death, and spent the subsequent 9 years making decisions about what to keep and what to dismantle, and how to build something that could eventually exist without the parts he was most ashamed of. Eventually, she said. It's slow, he said. Slower than I'd like. What's making it slow? He looked at the window for a moment. Inertia. People who've built their lives around the old structure and don't know how to operate in a different one. And he paused. The precise pause of honest self-examination. The fact that the fear is useful. I've never fully wanted to give it up, and that's something I'm still working on. She looked at him steadily. That's the most honest thing you've said since you got here. I know. Keep doing that. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite the thing that wasn't quite a smile. Something slightly closer than that, and she noticed the progression with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been paying attention. They talked until the practical elements of the evening became impossible to ignore. The late hour, the fact that she had a 7 o'clock the next morning, the fact that the coffee she'd made 2 hours ago had gone cold on the table between them. He stood to leave, and she walked him to the door, and they stood in the doorway for a moment with the specific gravity of people who had just covered significant distance and hadn't quite found the landing yet. The condition stands, she said. I know. I mean permanently. I understood you the first time. She nodded. He held her gaze for a moment with the full, unhurried quality she had never once managed to find unsettling. Unnerving in the early days, yes, but unsettling implied a threat. And whatever Dante Moretti was to her, he had never once been a threat. And then he left. She closed the door. She stood in her apartment in the quiet that followed his leaving and did an honest inventory of where she was. Not emotionally, she would get to that. The emotions were there and would require their appropriate time and space. But practically. The Reeves story was dead for now. Fitch's operation had no publication vehicle. Preston was sitting with accurate and could not move against her without using documentation that would expose his own conduct. Vanessa had been told plainly that the road was closed. The immediate crisis was managed. What remained was everything else. She washed the coffee cups. She went to bed. She slept this time without the broken quality of the previous nights, and woke at 6:15 to a message from Carla that said only, Reeves published something this morning, not the piece. Something else. You should read it. The article was 400 words, published on the paper's website at 5:40 in the morning, under a headline that described it as a correction to a developing investigation. It stated that a previous line of inquiry had been based on source material that, upon closer examination, contained significant conflicts of interest that the paper's editorial standards required to be disclosed before publication. It named no one. It was careful and precise and read, to anyone who understood how these things worked, as a journalist publicly protecting himself from a story that had gone sideways before it reached print. Imani read it twice. She sent Carla a message that said, Good. Now let's work. She arrived at the office at 7:15 and had a full client day that had nothing to do with any of it. A pharmaceutical company navigating a supply chain disclosure, a nonprofit managing the fallout from a board resignation, a follow-up call with a technology firm about a data incident from the previous quarter. She moved through all of it with the focused competence that her clients paid for and that she had never once let her personal life contaminate. And at 5:30 she closed her laptop and sat in the quiet of her empty office and allowed herself to feel, for the first time in 5 days, the full weight of what had just happened. Not the triumph of it. She was too honest for uncomplicated triumph. The weight of what it had cost. The 2 years with Preston, which had not been entirely bad. There had been good years in there. Genuine tenderness, real partnership in its early form before something shifted. And the specific grief of realizing that the engagement had not failed because of Vanessa, but because Preston had never fully believed in the version of Imani that he was asking to marry. He had loved a curated presentation of her. The softened edges, the managed ambition, the careful calibration of how much of herself she showed in a room where it might be threatening. When those edges had refused to stay soft, when she had refused to stay curated, the relationship had quietly developed a crack that neither of them had formally acknowledged until a parking lot on a Saturday night. She sat with that for a while. She thought about the ring, about how easily it had come off her finger, about whether that was because she had known, somewhere underneath everything, that it was supposed to come off, and whether the ease of removing it said something about the relationship or something about her, and whether those were actually different things. She thought about her mother. She thought about what it meant to build a life that was unmistakably your own in a world that was constantly offering you more comfortable, less accurate alternatives. She turned off her office light and went home. Preston called on a Friday, 3 weeks after the reunion. Not the compressed, pressurized Preston of the early morning call. A different version, quieter, less strategic, with the particular quality of a man who has been sitting with something long enough that the defenses have gotten tired. "I'm not calling to negotiate anything," he said. "I want you to know that first." "Okay," she said. "I've been thinking about what you said. On the phone that morning." A pause. "That I never let you know I had issues with how things were going, between us. That I managed around it instead of talking about it." She waited. "You were right," he said. "I'm not going to defend the way I handled any of it, because there isn't a defense. But I want you to know that the 2 years weren't, I wasn't performing it. I loved you. I just didn't know what to do with the ways I wasn't enough. And I made choices about that I can't take back." Imani sat at her kitchen table, the table she had been avoiding for 2 weeks. She had sat at it for the first time that morning and eaten breakfast there and found that it was just a table after all. "I know you loved me," she said. "That was never the part I was uncertain about." "Then what?" "The part I was uncertain about was whether you loved the version of me that was actually there or the version you needed me to be. And I think Vanessa made it easier to stop pretending you didn't know the answer." A long pause. "Yeah," he said, quietly, like the word cost something. "Yeah, I think that's right." She looked at the window. The morning was overcast, the light flat and even, the kind of day that was neither beautiful nor depressing but simply present. She had always found overcast days easier to work in. "Are you going to be okay?" she said. "I don't know yet." He said it with the honesty she recognized from the best parts of who he was, the parts she had loved before everything complicated. "Vanessa left. I think I knew she would. I think I knew she was going to leave from the moment I gave Fitch her direction, but by then you'd already invested too much to change course." Yes. She understood that. The particular trap of sunk cost. The way people continued down wrong roads because the distance they'd already traveled made turning back feel like waste rather than wisdom. She had done it herself with the engagement. She had the honesty to admit that. "Preston," she said, "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being angry at you. I don't have the energy for it, and it wouldn't do anything useful." She paused. "But I can't be your absolution either. You're going to have to find your way back to yourself without me being part of that story." A pause. "I know." "Good." "Imani." His voice had changed again, something softer and more final in it. "For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth much right now, the thing that scared me most about you was never what I said it was. It wasn't your ambition or your honesty or how much space you took up in a room. It was how clearly you saw me, every time, even when I was trying not to be seen." She was still. "You deserved someone who didn't find that frightening," he said. "Yes," she said. "I did." She ended the call, not harshly, with the quiet finality of someone closing a door that had been ajar too long. She put the phone on the table and sat for a moment and let the grief of it be what it was. Not catastrophic, not manageable, just real and human, and in the process of becoming finished. Then she made herself a second cup of coffee and went to her desk and started work. The month that followed was the kind of month that didn't announce itself as significant while it was happening. Imani took on 2 new clients, the kind she had been positioning her firm to attract for 3 years, the complex, high-stakes cases that other consultants assessed as too much risk and that she assessed as the most interesting work she would ever do. She hired a second senior consultant, a woman named Priya, who had 12 years of experience and the particular quality of someone who had spent a long time being the smartest person in the room and had recently decided to stop performing less than that. They worked well together in the blunt, efficient way of professionals who had identical standards and no patience for theater. She and Dante saw each other twice a week, which was a frequency that had emerged organically rather than negotiated, and which suited them both in the way that routines suit people who value predictability, not from fear but from the understanding that stable structure creates room for the unpredictable things you actually want. He did not investigate her further. She knew this not because he said so. He said so. But that was insufficient evidence on its own. But because she watched for it with the same professional attention she brought to everything else, and found no indicators. More importantly, he began, in ways that were small and not theatrical, to tell her things before she would have needed to discover them. Information about decisions he was making, about people in his organization who were aware of her, about the continuing process of separating legitimate operations from criminal ones. He did not ask for her approval. He offered transparency in the way people offered things they understood were owed. She received it without making it into more than it was. There was an evening, 6 weeks after the reunion, when he arrived at her apartment with a look she had not seen on him before. Not the controlled stillness, not the assessment, but something underneath both of those that was quieter and more exposed. And she opened the door and looked at him and said, "Come in and tell me what happened." He came in. He told her. One of his longest-standing lieutenants, a man named Caruso, who had been with the organization for 18 years, and who Dante had trusted with significant operational decisions, had been quietly running a parallel operation for the last 14 months. Moving money through channels Dante had specifically shut down. Rebuilding structures Dante had dismantled. When Dante's people found it, Caruso had not attempted to deny it. He had sat across from Dante in an office and explained, with the calm clarity of a man who had made his decision and was at peace with having it known, that he believed Dante was destroying something that didn't need to be destroyed, and that he had been preserving it for the day Dante came back to his senses. "What did you do?" Imani said. Dante looked at the window. "I removed him from every operational position, cut his access, gave him 2 weeks to settle his affairs, and made it clear that what he did wasn't something I could keep inside the organization." "Did he fight it?" "No." A pause. "That was almost worse. He accepted it like it confirmed everything he believed, that I'd gone soft, that I wasn't the same person anymore." "Are you?" she said. He looked at her. "The same person?" "Soft?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I'm making different choices. That's not the same thing as soft." "I know," she said. "I was asking if you knew." He looked at her with the particular quality she had come to understand as the closest he came to vulnerable. Not the surface of it, but the thing underneath that didn't perform vulnerability because it didn't need to, because it was the real article. "Most of the time," he said. "When I'm with you, yes. Other times," he stopped. "Other times, I'm less certain." She nodded. "That's honest." "I'm trying," he said. "I know you are." She looked at him steadily. "Dante, what Caruso said, that you're not the same person. He's right. You're not the same person you were when you built that organization. That's not a failure. That's the only thing about you that gives this—" She gestured between them, the apartment, the situation, all of it. Any viability at all. He was quiet. "If you were still the same person," she said, "I would not be here." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know, that's what makes it worth it." She made dinner. They ate at her kitchen table, which was just a table now, firmly and completely, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with organizations or reputations or the complicated machinery of their respective lives, about a book he'd been reading on urban architecture, about a case she was working on that she could describe in broad strokes without violating client confidence, about a restaurant Priya had recommended that they could test on Saturday. The ordinary conversation of two people who had arrived at the stage past the crisis and found that what was underneath it was something that didn't require drama to sustain itself. She washed the dishes. He dried them. This was not symbolic. It was just dishes. But she noticed it anyway. 2 months after the reunion, Imani's firm got the call she had been building toward for 4 years. A major healthcare company, national presence, significant public profile. A crisis that had been developing for 6 weeks and was about to go fully public, needed a lead crisis strategist who could handle complexity, media pressure, legal coordination, and the particular challenge of managing internal panic while presenting external stability. The company's existing communications director had tendered his resignation the previous afternoon. They needed someone immediately. They had been given her name by 3 separate sources. She took the meeting. She sat across from a board chairman and 2 senior vice presidents and a general counsel in a conference room in the top floor of a building downtown, and she told them what she would do and how she would do it and what she would need from them. And she did this without softening it, without performing less confidence than she felt, without managing the edges of her certainty to make the men across the table more comfortable with her assurance. The general counsel, a woman named Harriet, who was in her 60s and had the specific bearing of someone who had stopped tolerating unnecessary friction about 20 years ago, watched Imani through the whole presentation and said nothing until the end, and then said, "When can you start?" "Monday," Imani said. "We need you this afternoon," Harriet said. "Then I have 2 calls to reschedule," Imani said. "Give me 30 minutes." She walked out of the conference room to make the calls. And in the brief quiet of the hallway, she allowed herself 1 moment. Not celebration, not relief, but the quiet, grounded recognition of a woman who had been building towards something for years and had just arrived at it without losing anything she refused to lose. Then she made the calls and went back in. She told Dante that evening. They were at his office, which had become a comfortable secondary space for her, in the way that certain places became comfortable, gradually, through repeated presence, until you stopped noticing you were somewhere that wasn't your own. She was at the long table with client files. He was at his desk. The arrangement had the routine ease of people who had learned each other's working rhythms and accommodated them without discussion. She told him about the healthcare company, about the board meeting, and Harriet, and the afternoon she'd spent beginning to map the crisis architecture, while a communications team she'd inherited tried to figure out who she was and whether to trust her. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What's your timeline?" 3 months minimum, possibly 6. "It's going to be consuming." "Yes." "How can I not get in the way of it?" She looked at him. The specificity of the question, not how can I help, but how can I stay out of the way, landed accurately. "Keep the twice a week. Don't cancel unless it's unavoidable. And when I tell you I need to work, believe me the first time." "Done," he said. "That's it," she said. "That's enough," he said. She went back to her files. He went back to his work. The office was quiet in the productive way, and she thought, not for the first time, about how little she had expected this. The specific companionship of a person who made space for who you actually were because they were more interested in who you actually were than in the version that would be easier to accommodate. She had expected, at 31, to be somewhere simpler than this. She was glad she wasn't. The healthcare crisis took 4 months. She did not disappear into it. She was too organized for that, too deliberately structured about the boundaries between her professional and personal hours. But she was immersed in it in the way that demanding work immersed her, and the months moved with the particular speed of time spent doing exactly what you were built to do. She navigated the media pressure. She managed the internal fear that threatened to fracture the executive team at the 6-week mark. She coordinated with legal in a way that required both to give more ground than either was initially willing to give, and she did this by being direct about the fact that they were serving the same goal through different methods, and that acknowledging this would make everyone's work faster. She presented at a press conference in month 3 and handled the question session with the controlled, clear-eyed precision that Harriet later described in a phone call to the 3 people who had referred Imani as the best crisis communication I've witnessed in 40 years of legal work. Priya managed the firm's other clients through those months. She did it without requiring more guidance than Imani could provide in their morning check-ins. And at the end of the 4 months, Imani looked at what Priya had built in her relative absence and understood that she had, at some point in the previous year, stopped running a one-woman operation and started running an actual firm. She gave Priya a title that matched what she was already doing and a compensation adjustment that matched the title, and Priya accepted both with the equanimity of someone who had been waiting for the acknowledgement and was pleased it had arrived without requiring a negotiation. The year mark arrived the way year marks always did, not as a milestone so much as a point at which it became natural to look back. Imani was at her desk on a Tuesday evening, the week before the anniversary of the reunion, when she found herself doing the involuntary accounting that anniversaries prompted, the before and after, the what was versus what is, the internal audit of loss and gain. She thought about the woman in the parking lot. She remembered her clearly. The dress, the ring coming off her finger, the specific quality of that moment, the way it had contained both devastation and underneath it, something that might have been the first clean breath she'd taken in a long time. She had not recognized it as that at the time. She had been too busy being furious, too busy managing the devastation, too busy walking into that ballroom with her spine straight and her face arranged and her hands not shaking. She wondered sometimes what would have happened if she hadn't walked toward the bar, if she hadn't noticed Dante, if she'd simply gotten through the night and driven home and begun the ordinary process of dissolving an engagement without the entire subsequent complication. She would have been fine. She knew that. She had never needed that night to become something other than what it appeared to be in order to survive it. She was not a woman who required rescue, but she was glad. In the particular way, she was glad for things she had not chosen, but had accepted with full awareness. She was glad for the complication. For the stranger near the bar who had agreed to a 20-minute performance and stayed 4 hours. For the 100 conversations since. For the homework she'd done on herself in the space that opened when Preston left. The hard, unglamorous work of understanding what she had been accepting in the name of love and what she was no longer willing to accept. For the condition, and that he had met it. Not perfectly. They had argued twice in the 4 months. Real arguments, the kind with raised voices and a door that closed harder than strictly necessary, about the pace of his organizational changes, and about an instance in month 2 when he had made a decision that affected her public schedule without consulting her. Both arguments had resolved not through one party capitulating, but through the slower, more effortful process of two people with legitimate positions finding the line where those positions could coexist. It had not been clean. She did not require clean. She required honest and she required real, and she had both. He called on a Thursday, the week of the anniversary. "I want to take you somewhere Saturday," he said. "Where?" "The Harrington Grand." She was quiet for a moment. "Dante." "I know," he said. "I want to go back. Not for anyone else. I want—" He paused. The real pause. "I want to replace the memory of it with something different." She thought about the parking lot. The ring. Preston's hands in his pockets. "What time?" she said. 7. "I'll be ready." The dress she chose was emerald green. Not because it was a statement. She was done with dresses as statements, done with clothing as armor or announcement. She chose it because she had seen it in a shop window 2 months ago and loved it immediately without thinking about what it communicated, and had bought it without returning it twice, and had been looking for an occasion to wear it. This was an occasion. He arrived at 7 precisely. He looked at the dress, and then at her face and said nothing, which was the correct response and the one she expected. The drive to the Harrington Grand took 18 minutes. They didn't fill the drive with conversation. The radio was on at a low volume, something instrumental, and the city moved past the windows with the indifferent beauty that cities managed at night when the light was on everything, and the distances between things looked smaller than they were in daylight. The hotel was hosting 3 events that night: a wedding on the upper floor, a corporate dinner in the East Wing, and something in the small ballroom that had the decorative markers of a charitable gala. The lobby was peopled with the mixed crowds that resulted. Tuxedos beside business suits beside the deliberate glamour of guests who had dressed for a specific occasion. Dante had reserved a table in the hotel's main restaurant, not the ballroom. The restaurant was adjacent to it, separated by a corridor and a set of doors that were closed but not locked, and their table was positioned near the window that looked out onto the same ground she had looked at from the parking lot a year ago. She noticed. She said nothing about it. They had dinner, real dinner, the unhurried kind, and the conversation moved through its familiar terrain. His work, her work. Priya. A trip they had been discussing to a city neither of them had been to, but both had reasons to visit, the book on urban architecture that he had finished, and she had borrowed and was halfway through. She drank one glass of wine. He had water. The restaurant was full enough to generate ambient warmth without being loud, and the table felt, as their tables had generally come to feel, like a room they'd built together out of repeated occupation. After dinner, he looked at her. "Will you walk with me?" he said. She knew where they were going. They walked through the lobby and through the corridor and through the doors and into the ballroom, which was empty between events. The wedding upstairs was in full ceremony, the gala wasn't scheduled until 9, and the lights were on the low setting that hotel ballrooms defaulted to between uses. The chandeliers dimmed to half, the round tables cleared and set for some future event with fresh linen and folded napkins and centerpieces that caught what light there was. She stood in the middle of it. She looked at the bar where she had stood with a glass of water and the specific decision of a woman who had refused to leave. At the space near the far end where she had noticed a stranger standing alone. At the place where Preston had crossed the floor toward them, with his hands out of his pockets and his composure doing something difficult. She had not expected to feel what she felt, which was something that didn't have a precise name, not nostalgia. Nostalgia required sentimentality about the past. And she was clear-eyed about what the past had actually been. Something closer to gratitude for the accuracy of it, for the fact that it had happened as badly as it had happened, cleanly and irreversibly, in a way that had not allowed her to stay in something that was no longer true. Dante stood beside her. He did not look at the room. He looked at her. She became aware of this and looked back. He was watching her face with the full, unhurried attention she had stopped finding unnerving somewhere in the third week of knowing him. That attention which was not performing interest but actually paying it, actually receiving her with the completeness that she had spent most of her adult life encountering in partial form at best. He reached into his jacket. She understood what was happening before it resolved into the visible form of it, and she felt something move through her chest that was not the dramatic internal weather of romantic fiction, but something quieter and more actual. A shift in weight, a redistribution of something she had been carrying for a long time. He held the ring between them. It was simple. She registered that immediately, because she had expected something that announced itself and this did not. A dark band with a single stone, nothing that performed wealth or tried to compensate for anything. It looked like the choice of a man who had thought about what would suit her rather than what would impress a room. "I know the timing of this location is not without complication," he said. She almost smiled. "That's one way to describe it. I wanted to come back here because I didn't want the last memory in this room to be the one we walked in with." He looked at her steadily. "You walked in here alone a year ago. I want you to remember walking out differently." She looked at the ring. She thought about every version of this moment she had imagined in her life, the versions where she was younger and the circumstances were simpler and the person across from her was uncomplicated in the ways she had once believed people could be uncomplicated. She thought about the engagement to Preston and what it had cost her to give it back, and what it had cost her to understand that giving it back had been the act of a woman who knew the difference between loving someone and building a life that was actually hers. She thought about her mother. She thought about what her mother would see, standing in this ballroom, looking at the woman her daughter had become, not in spite of the difficulty, but through it, shaped by it without being broken by it. A woman who had built something real from her own labor, who had faced a coordinated attempt to diminish her and had taken it apart from the inside using nothing but skill and accuracy and the refusal to be afraid of what she was, who was standing now in a dress she had bought for herself because she loved it, in a room where she had once been publicly humiliated, with a man who was complicated and honest about it, and trying in ways that cost him something. She thought her mother would have recognized this. She thought her mother would have said, in the specific voice she used when she meant something completely, "That's my daughter." "I need you to understand something before I answer," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I'm not going to change for this," she said. "Not my size, not my volume, not how much space I take up. Not my career, not my firm, not my standards for how I'm treated. I'm not going to make myself easier to have because you have complicated parts, and it would be simpler if I had fewer demands." "I know," he said. I need you to say that like you mean it, and not like you're agreeing with a condition. He looked at her. I'm not marrying a version of you that's easier to have, he said. I'm asking you because you refused to be that, and because the woman who handed back a ring in a parking lot and walked into a room full of people who expected her to be smaller than she was and was not, in any way, smaller. That's who I want to spend the rest of my life not being able to predict. She held his gaze for a long time. The ballroom was empty around them. No audience, no Preston, no Vanessa, no performance in any direction, just two people standing in a room full of history that had brought them to this specific point through a sequence of events that neither would have designed and both had survived. Yes, she said. Not dramatically, not with tears or a voice that shook, with the particular steadiness of a woman who had examined the decision from every angle with the full force of her professional and personal intelligence and had arrived at the answer with her eyes open and her feet on the ground. He placed the ring on her finger. She looked at it. It fit. Not the metaphorical fit of a thing that had been waiting to happen. The literal, precise, physical fit of something that had been measured correctly. She looked up from it and found that his expression had done the thing it had been working toward since the first night she'd watched it in the dim light of a hotel bar. It had arrived at the full form of what it had been building toward, and it was not what she had once imagined a smile from Dante Moretti would look like. It was quieter and more personal than that. It was the expression of a man who had not expected to be here and was glad that he was. She put her hand against his jaw for a moment. He turned his face slightly into it. Then she straightened, and he straightened, and they stood together in the empty ballroom, and she looked at the room one more time. She thought about the woman who had walked in here a year ago. She thought about what that woman had been carrying, the ring she gave back, the 2 years, the 10 years before that of being underestimated in rooms just like this one, of walking into spaces and feeling the calculation in other people's eyes, the instant reduction, the weight of assumptions assembled from a single look before she had said one word or demonstrated one thing. She thought about all the things that woman had survived before that night, and all the things she had built since. The dress was emerald green and the chandeliers were at half, and the tables were set for someone else's occasion, and none of that was arranged for her, and she had never, not once in her life, required arrangement. She looked at Dante. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," he said. They walked out of the ballroom together, through the corridor and through the lobby, and out into the night air of the city that had always been indifferent to her story and was still indifferent, magnificently and helpfully indifferent, because she had never needed the city to care. She had built everything that mattered herself, and she was not finished building. The people who had tried to reduce her that year settled into the ordinary consequences of their choices without drama or visible punishment. Preston moved to another city 8 months after the reunion. He found work in a smaller market, in a firm that suited his actual abilities rather than the inflated ones he had been performing. He sent Imani one message before he left. Not an apology, they had already done that. Just 3 words, "You were right." She read it and put the phone down and did not reply. Not from cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say that would be useful to either of them. Vanessa left the city for a period and returned without the social architecture she'd spent years constructing. The connections she'd built on performed proximity to influence rather than genuine relationship dissolved with the influence, which was the natural end of anything built on pretending. She was last seen by someone who knew Imani at a fundraising event, thinner and more careful and standing at the edge of a room in a way that looked, to the person who noticed, like someone who had forgotten how to walk in without calculating the terrain first. Gerald Fitch continued his work for other clients. His file stayed in Imani's records. She did not use it. Callum Reeves published a different piece on the Moretti organization 3 months later. Careful, sourced, precise, with no human interest angle that involved Imani or anyone close to her. It was good journalism. She read it and noted its accuracy and moved on. Dante separated the last criminal operation from his legitimate businesses over the course of the following year. It was not clean, and it was not without cost. 2 people who had been central to the organization left when the criminal components were shut down, and one of those departures came with a period of tension that required resolution she was not involved in and did not ask details about, because she had determined for herself the boundary between what was his to manage and what she needed to know. And she held that line with the same steadiness she held everything else. He told her what she needed to know. She believed him, not from naivety, but from the accumulated evidence of a man who was consistently honest, even when honesty was inconvenient. The legitimate businesses ran well. The real estate company broke ground on a third affordable housing development. The logistics firm promoted Raymond to a managing director position, and Raymond gave a brief speech at the company gathering that Dante described to Imani afterward with the kind of quiet pride that people showed about things they cared about but hadn't learned to claim yet. She told him he could claim it. He was working on it. A year and 3 months after the reunion, Imani Caldwell established her own crisis strategy firm under her own name, split formally from the firm she'd been building within, and within 6 months had a client list that other consultants described as impossible, and that she described as exactly the right amount of difficult. Priya ran the operational side. Imani ran the strategic side. They argued productively about 3 things a week and agreed efficiently about everything else. And the firm developed, in the way of things that were built correctly from the beginning, a reputation that preceded it into rooms before either of them arrived. The woman who had been mocked for her size became known, in her industry, for the particular quality of her judgment in conditions where most people's judgment failed. Nobody who worked with her professionally connected that to a hotel parking lot or a ballroom or a stranger near a bar, because those events were private. And Imani had always been clear about the distinction between what she built publicly and what she kept for herself. She kept for herself a marriage that was not simple and did not try to be, built between 2 people who had entered it with full knowledge of each other's complications and had decided that knowing was not a reason to step back, but a reason to step forward with accuracy. She kept for herself the memory of her mother's voice, consulted privately at moments when the world offered a more comfortable alternative to who she actually was. She kept for herself the understanding, arrived at not through the ballroom or the ring or the man who had been standing near the bar, but through the entire sequence of things that had required her to choose, repeatedly, to be exactly who she was, that nobody had ever needed to grant her permission. The woman who walked into her future needed no adjustment. She had always been the whole thing.